Lyra had always believed she had it all: an ideal life, a loving marriage, and a thriving business with her husband Caleb. Their relationship had been built on years of shared experiences, laughter, and mutual respect. Their company, a boutique marketing firm, had grown exponentially, fueled by Caleb's brilliant ideas and Lyra's unwavering support. They were partners in every sense of the word, a duo admired by everyone who knew them. Their bond seemed unbreakable, and life, for the most part, was smooth and predictable. Then there was Sarah, Lyra's older sister, who always had her life together. With a career as a renowned therapist and an aura of grace, Sarah had always been the pillar of stability in the family. She knew what to say, when to step in, and when to take charge. Lyra admired her, though a hint of envy sometimes lingered. Sarah had always seemed perfect, while Lyra, for all her accomplishments, always felt just a little more human. But it wasn't until Caleb's mysterious illness began to unravel their world that things began to shift. At first it was small: fatigue that wouldn't go away, odd aches, a slight pallor to his skin. But as weeks passed, the changes became undeniable. Lyra couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the perfect life they'd built was slowly slipping away. And as the shadows grew larger, so did the unspoken tension between them all. The day Caleb received his diagnosis was the day time itself seemed to freeze. A rare, aggressive disease, terminal, with no cure. The words hung in the air, suffocating Lyra. She didn't know how to react, her mind swirling in disbelief. The doctor spoke, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Caleb, usually so strong and vibrant, looked suddenly fragile, as if the life they'd built together could shatter in an instant. The initial shock was the hardest part. In the hours following the diagnosis, Lyra felt like she was in a fog. The reality of their new situation didn't sink in immediately. She found herself unable to speak, to ask questions. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg for a miracle, but she couldn't. Caleb sat next to her, stoic, trying to hold it together for both of them. Yet she could see the cracks in his armor, the way he kept pulling away, emotionally and physically. As the weeks passed, Caleb's withdrawal became more pronounced. He had no energy for the business they had poured their hearts into for years, leaving Lyra to handle things alone. The heavy weight of the diagnosis began to feel suffocating. Caleb, once so engaged and enthusiastic, retreated into a shell. Lyra had to navigate their life, their business, and the looming grief, all while struggling to keep her own composure. And as her world tilted, Sarah appeared, more often than not, like a calming force, stepping in where Caleb couldn't, and offering her support. But Lyra began to notice something strange in Sarah's gaze, a new intensity that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It began subtly. Small decisions made without consulting Lyra, moments when Sarah would step in, offering solutions before Lyra had even thought to voice her concerns. It started with business matters. Caleb, in his increasingly frail state, had been relying more and more on Sarah to take the reins, particularly when it came to meetings or dealing with clients. Lyra didn't mind at first. She knew her sister meant well, and Caleb needed someone who could keep things afloat while he dealt with his illness. But soon, Sarah's presence began to feel less like helpful assistance and more like an unwelcome takeover. It wasn't just in the business. Lyra noticed it during family dinners, in quiet conversations, and even in Caleb's hospital room. Sarah would make decisions about his care without consulting Lyra first. She would subtly steer Caleb's treatment plans or offer advice, with an air of authority that left Lyra feeling sidelined in her own life. Caleb's reactions were strange. His face would tighten, his mouth would open as though he wanted to speak, but he never did. It was like he was caught between his sister and his wife, unable to express his discomfort. Lyra tried to dismiss the discomfort as stress. After all, things were changing so rapidly, and everyone was simply trying to cope. But something didn't feel right. It was the way Sarah's eyes glinted with a kind of quiet determination when she looked at Caleb, as though she was trying to protect him from something. Or maybe from someone. Lyra. And as Sarah's role in their lives deepened, so did the whispers in Lyra's mind. Was it just stress? Or was Sarah crossing a line? As Caleb's health worsened, the unspoken reality of their situation settled like a dark cloud over the family. Conversations that used to be about future plans, dreams, and expansion were now reduced to cold discussions about what would happen when Caleb was no longer there. His once bright vision for their business now seemed irrelevant in the face of his impending death. Lyra could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. It was during one of these heavy conversations that Sarah suggested Caleb make a new will, one that would protect Lyra, ensuring she wasn't left in a vulnerable position after Caleb's death. At first, Lyra was grateful. It made sense to secure their future. But as Sarah proposed changes, Lyra's unease began to rise. The revisions were not only extensive, they seemed to favor Sarah far too heavily. Business assets, property, and even personal investments were suddenly in Sarah's name. Caleb, clearly exhausted and overwhelmed, seemed reluctant, his eyes darting toward Lyra for reassurance. Yet, with Sarah's persuasive words and promises of security, Caleb agreed to the changes, and the will was drafted. Lyra's discomfort only deepened as she watched the process unfold. Her trust in Sarah, once unwavering, was now fraying at the edges. But Caleb's health deteriorated so rapidly that there was no time to address her suspicions. As the days dwindled, Caleb, knowing there was no time left, handed Lyra a letter, telling her to open it only if something didn't feel right. Lyra kept the letter in her pocket, her heart heavy with dread, wondering if, deep down, she already knew what was coming. Caleb's death was sudden, a cruel shock that left everyone reeling. There were no final words, no warning, just a painful silence that followed him. Lyra was numb as she stood at his bedside, unable to comprehend that the man who had been her, everything was now gone. The funeral was a blur, filled with empty condolences and unspoken emotions. But amid the grief, something gnawed at Lyra, an unsettling feeling that only deepened as the days passed. Mr. Bennet, the family lawyer, called them together to read Caleb's will. Lyra's heart pounded as she sat in the quiet room, surrounded by Sarah's carefully composed presence. Sarah, dressed in black, played the part of the grieving widow flawlessly, her eyes a mixture of sorrow and something else Lyra couldn't quite place, perhaps triumph. Lyra's instincts screamed at her to open the letter Caleb had given her, the one sealed with his last instructions. But as she sat there, her fingers trembling around the envelope, she hesitated. Was she ready to face whatever Caleb had left for her? Or was she too afraid of what it might reveal? Mr. Bennet cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and began to read Caleb's original will. Lyra's breath caught as the words sank in. Caleb had left everything, every asset, every part of the business, every home and investment, to Sarah. It was clear now. Sarah was the sole beneficiary. Lyra's world tilted as she glanced at Sarah, who seemed unmoved, as if this had been inevitable all along. The truth was undeniable, and with it, the crushing realization that nothing, not even Caleb's love, could protect Lyra from the web of deceit that had been spun around her. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for Caleb's letter. The envelope felt heavier than she remembered, as though it contained more than just words. It carried the weight of everything she had just learned. The wax seal on the back glimmered ominously, its crimson hue reflecting the dim light in the room. She hesitated for a moment, then placed it on the table in front of her. A deep silence settled over the room, thick with anticipation. Sarah, sitting beside her, seemed overly concerned, her eyes flickering between the letter and Lyra, her expression one of practiced compassion. But Lyra noticed the subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor, the tightness around her eyes, the way she clasped her hands just a little too tightly. It was almost as if Sarah knew something Lyra didn't, as if she was bracing for the storm that was about to come. Mr. Bennet, without a word, took the letter and carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. Caleb's handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakable. The words, though few, were sharp and filled with regret. In his final words, Caleb confessed his regret about signing the new will, admitting that he had been manipulated by Sarah's persuasion. His voice, even through the letter, was filled with sorrow. He knew what Sarah intended, and in his final act of clarity, he reversed the changes made in the will, ensuring that Lyra would inherit everything he had once promised her. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as the truth began to unfurl. Caleb had known. The silence that followed the reading of Caleb's letter was deafening. Sarah's face turned pale, then flushed with a mixture of shock and fury. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes darting from Mr. Bennet to Lyra, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as the gravity of the situation settled in, Sarah's composure cracked, and the mask of grief she had worn so carefully shattered. Her carefully constructed sadness was replaced with rage, her features twisted in disbelief and resentment. This isn't right," Sarah muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with anger. Caleb was too sick to understand what he was doing. He wouldn't have made this decision if he were in his right mind. Mr. Bennet remained calm, unfazed by the outburst. "Ms. Ward, the letter and the will are legally binding. Caleb's final wishes are clear. This will supersede the previous one. All of his assets, business interests, and properties now belong to Mrs. Ward." Sarah's face contorted with disbelief, and her hands clenched into fists. "No, this can't be happening. The will isn't valid. He was too ill to—" But Mr. Bennet cut her off with quiet authority. "The legal weight of Caleb's final decision cannot be ignored, Ms. Ward. This letter, in conjunction with the will, makes it clear that Lyra is the sole beneficiary of his estate. All decisions, assets, and business interests are now hers." Lyra watched Sarah unravel before her eyes, the woman who had always been so controlled, so perfect, now consumed by an anger she could no longer hide. The truth was undeniable. Caleb had seen through Sarah's manipulation, and in his final moments, he had made the ultimate choice to protect Lyra. The clarity that washed over Lyra was as overwhelming as it was painful. She could see Sarah for what she truly was, driven by something darker than love, her intentions tainted by greed and control. The betrayal was sharp, but in that moment Lyra knew she would be free. Caleb had made sure of it, even in his final moments. Sarah couldn't stand another second in that room. With a sharp intake of breath and a look of pure fury, she stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a resounding crack. Lyra sat motionless, the tension of the moment slowly starting to dissolve into a deep silence. She was left alone with Mr. Bennet, who watched her with quiet understanding, but didn't intrude on her thoughts. Lyra's mind churned, the weight of everything crashing over her like a tide. She thought back on the years spent in Sarah's shadow, how she had always admired her sister's composure, her seeming perfection. But now, she saw it all for what it truly was: manipulation, betrayal, hidden agendas she had been blind to. It stung, but it was also a revelation. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat, offering a soft, "If you need anything, Mrs. Ward, I'm just a call away." His voice was kind, but it was clear he knew that this was Lyra's moment to process. With a final glance at her, he left the room, leaving her to her thoughts. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a strange sense of relief. Caleb had given her the truth, his final gift, and in that truth, she saw something more important than any material possession: trust. Caleb had loved her enough to protect her, even when he couldn't protect himself. The weeks that followed Caleb's passing were a blur of legal battles and necessary decisions, but amidst the chaos, Lyra began to reclaim control of her life, starting with the company. She couldn't continue running it the way it had been. The past needed to be left behind. She changed the company's name, rebranded, and slowly started to carve out her own path. The process of rebuilding was slow and exhausting, but with every small step, the weight on her shoulders lightened. She found solace in the little things: the morning sun warming her face, the quiet of her office when she sat alone, the rare moments of laughter with friends who weren't interested in controlling her life. Each small victory felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. Lyra took the time to reflect on Caleb's life and their years together. His mistakes were there, undeniable, but so was his love. In his final act, he had protected her in the only way he could, by giving her the truth. It wasn't about the business or the money. It was about trust, about giving her the strength to stand on her own, without the shadows of manipulation looming over her. As for Sarah, their relationship was broken. Lyra could see clearly now that she had never needed her sister's approval or control. She had only needed to trust herself, and in that trust, she found strength. Looking out of the window, Lyra reflected on the lessons she had learned. How sometimes closure doesn't come from conversations or explanations, but from a sealed envelope, a final act of truth. Caleb had given her that, even in the moments when his illness left him too weak to fight back. And in that gift, she had found not only closure, but freedom. She had confronted the truth: Sarah's deception, Caleb's final choice, the tangled emotions, and it had set her free. She had learned to trust her instincts, to no longer wait for confirmation from others when something felt wrong. Her journey wasn't just about healing from betrayal, but about reclaiming her own power. With a quiet strength, she stepped forward, knowing that no one else could define her anymore. Her past had shaped her, but her future was her own. And as the story of her life continued, she would trust her gut, knowing that truth, no matter how painful, would always be her guide.